Alexa, tell Science Salon to play the new episode. Alexa skills are voice-driven capabilities that enhance and personalize your Alexa devices. Simply say, Alexa, enable Science Salon skill, or go to skeptic.com/Alexa to enable it. This is your host, Michael Shermer, and you're listening to Science Salon, a series of conversations with leading scientists, scholars, and thinkers about the most important issues of our time. Just by way of background, of course, he already got an introduction as the author of The Drunkard's Walk and The Worldviews, which he did with Deepak Chopra. And then, but more interestingly to me, your co-authored book with Stephen Hawking is especially poignant now since we just lost him. So I thought as a seg into talking about different ways of thinking, clearly this is one of the things that appealed to people about Hawking's form of brilliance was that, it was like a brain in a jar, or a disconnected mind floating above the body. It was just sort of such an odd thing. And you knew him, so maybe tell us a little bit about what it was like to work with Stephen Hawking.
Well, that is the stereotype of the scientist, the brain in a jar, even when it doesn't seem so. The person isn't physically challenged. People think of a scientist as brain in a jar, or if you look at the Hollywood films, they're nerds who only focus on their work, and so that's totally false.
Right.
And he was a very good guy, and probably the most telling human characteristic he had was a great sense of humor. And I still remember, we would have a lot of discussions. Debates as we were writing the books. We didn't always agree on what to say, and he took about in those days he could do about 6 words in a minute. He could do about 6 words. So what I just said would be a minute or two. So you can imagine that it goes rather slowly, and we'd go back and forth on some ridiculously minor point, both of us being stubborn. And what was really interesting was that even though I could say everything very easily, it doesn't take much effort for me to utter my few sentences. He'd have to work very hard, and still, I would be the one who gave up out of exhaustion. And what sticks out was one time, especially we were having some heated discussion, and I'm sat there waiting for minutes and minutes and minutes for him to give his answer to what I said. And when it finally came, it was a joke. So he had a really good sense of humor, and he was not a brain in a jar.
Yes. I can't remember if it was you or Kip Thorne that was mentioning that he thinks more in geometrical rather than mathematical thinking. I don't even know what that means for
well, so how do you explain that? A lot of physics you can do with equations, but the equations have geometric interpretations. So sometimes what would be a bunch of mathematical equations that follow certain rules, like when he did sines and cosines. Remember that? And well, you can also think of sometimes the same things in terms of, let's say, lines or planes, and especially in general relativity, which is very geometric theory. So he would think in terms of the shapes and the relationships of those shapes. How you could go, totally off equations. I don't know, and I don't know if he did. But I know he did think geometrically. But to me, what was really miraculous was that he could even do anything without a blackboard or a pad of paper.
Right.
Because if that's part of the stereotype is true, the scientist is always like writing stuff. Now, how do you keep in your working memory all these different ideas without that external hard drive of the pad of paper?
Maybe like you hear these stories about, the blind are more sensitive to what they hear. Not that we can't hear it, we just don't pay attention to what the sounds mean for navigating a room. Maybe just developed his sort of internal visualization of space-time and whatever the problems are that he couldn't write down.
Maybe. Maybe he had that certain gift that you ever see chess players play blindfolded. Or when I was in high school, one guy could play 16 games simultaneously blindfolded. He would go from one to the other, all the way around. I would always say, take one guy out and don't tell him. but and that is something that often goes away when people get older. But anyway, yeah, it was amazing. So he was an amazing guy.
You know, the stories that have come out just since he died. You had a beautiful op-ed eulogy to him in the New York Times about what it was like to work with him, and then there was these stories coming out that his last published paper just submitted, that maybe he solved the problem of the multiverse.
Well, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
So at the end of his life, he was working on. He had his own specific theory that we described in the grand design of how M theory works together with the multiverse and different universes and stuff. And the key to that would be to find some sign of that in the cosmic microwave background radiation. And that was, I know, his hope was to do that eventually. And I haven't seen that paper, so I don't know what he says, but. It's very. We found a lot of evidence for inflation in modern theories of physics through the cosmic microwave background, and whether there is that signature of multiple universes, I guess we'll see. But I know, surprised that the media sometimes does exaggerate scientific issues, so I'm reserving judgment.
Yeah, like a good scientist. And since, on that subject, since the grand design came out, that was maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, gravitational waves have been discovered and the Nobel Prize is given for that. Did those discoveries change any of the ideas you and Hawking had presented in? No, okay.
No, because gravitational waves everyone expected to see, and so and they had been seen indirectly. It was really a Nobel Prize given out for that because there was a system observed that was a black hole and a neutron star binary that were rotating around each other, and the neutron star is not invisible, and the black hole is, and so you could watch what was happening, and the orbit decayed in a way that was significant of it gravitational radiation being given off. So the energy loss in that system matched with the predictions of gravitational waves. We didn't see the gravitational waves, but we saw the indirect evidence. So everyone knew Einstein was right there. So,
right.
But LIGO is not just detect gravitational waves, but by detecting gravitational waves and the details of those gravitational waves, we are now able to study gravitational systems that you can't see, or systems not by their electromagnetic radiation like a telescope, but this is like a gravity telescope. So it's not just that we see that the gravity waves are present, but we can now look at systems and analyze what they're doing based on the gravity waves that they give off, just like we can look at stars through their through their light radiation. So it's a whole new way of observing the universe. So that's really the significance of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and in terms of like elastic thinking, I was dialoguing with Kip Thorne last month at our salon and trying to get him to explain what this means, what gravity actually is. Because we think of it as like a force, but okay, no, it's not a force, all right, then what is it? And he kept saying it's time. It has to do with time and the equations, and I'm completely out of my league already anyway before I even ask. But then to try to make the sort of elastic leap to this completely different way of thinking, I was pressing him on what Einstein did. Was it like a Kuhnian paradigm shift where there were all these anomalies piling up, and he had a new theory that explained the anomalies as well as the old facts about the universe? No, it's that he just did like a thought experiment in his head with the, falling at the rate of gravity and traveling at the speed of light, that sort of thing. And that he just sort of came up with this completely new way of thinking, which, I can't imagine how you can do that short of some of the suggestions in your book of ayahuasca or something, but I don't think he did that.
If you read that book, you will become an Einstein. So
yes.
just that, the key is right there.
But I mean, it seems to me that's a good example of somebody,
Yeah, well, his really signature was to see very clearly the assumptions things are based on. So one of the issues I talk about in Elastic is that often what's blocking us from solving a problem or seeing the answer to something that we're trying to solve is that we make assumptions that we're not even aware of making. And if you can train yourself to try to be aware that you're making these assumptions, and that's the biggest step toward solving certain problems. And we were talking before this about riddles, so why don't we just go into the riddle, if that's okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
And riddles are a good example of that. Riddles are basically usually designed to based on that point. I'll give you. You want to read it? So
Yeah.
I don't want. Usually the wording is somewhat important, even though there's no trick in these riddles. But these are a couple riddles.
So this is from
these are from the book, but they are taken from a paper in the Journal of Problem Solving. So I didn't make these up.
I didn't even know there was such a journal.
Yeah, there are many journals on that topic, but there's one with that particular name, which is not a very creative name, but it tells you what it is a journal of, doesn't it?
All right.
Solves the problem of identifying the journal.
So these are some of the brain teasers, and we'll give you a few seconds, or just blurt it out if you think you figured it out. So
wait, no, don't blurt it out.
Don't blurt it out.
Because so he'll read just one of those things
Okay.
talking about, and then let's give everybody a chance to think about it for a minute, and then we'll ask them to.
Okay, a man is reading a book when the lights go off, but even though the room he is in is pitch dark, the man goes on reading. How? And the book was not in an electronic format.
Okay. Think about it for a minute. Okay.
A man is reading a book when the lights go off, but even though the room he is in is pitch dark, the man goes on reading. How? I think some people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Braille.
Braille. Yeah.
So
That was-
so the reason that if you have difficulty getting that, or if it takes you a while to get that, it's because when you hear a man is reading a book, you have a picture in your head, like of Michael sitting there, and that picture is a false assumption, right? Because it's not someone going like this; it's someone running his or her fingers across the book. So once you realize that, start questioning your assumptions. And if you come upon that assumption, it's very easy to get the answer, but it's finding that assumption that is the challenge.
Number 2, a magician claimed to be able to throw a ping pong ball so that it would go a short distance, come to a dead stop, and then reverse itself. He added that he would not accomplish this by bouncing the ball off any object, tying anything to it, or giving it a spin. How could he perform this feat? Magician throws a ping pong ball, goes a short distance, stops, reverses itself. It's not tied to any string or...
The wind? You could do that. I think we should accept that one. But yeah, we're thinking throw it up, right? So you're picturing it bouncing off something.
Yeah.
But he's not bouncing off something. It's a quandary, but that's all a red herring because there's nothing to do with bouncing off anything. If you throw it up, gravity will bring it back down. You could just read the Marcia Marjorie one.
Now, if Penn and Teller did it, the ball would go up and just disappear. Okay. Marcia and Marjorie were born on the same day of the same month of the same year to the same mother and the same father, yet they are not twins. How is that possible? Donor eggs. Oh boy, we have a good audience here. It's almost always simpler than you think. Marcia and Marjorie, born on the same day of the same year, of the same month of the same year, to the same mother and same father.
You got it? No.
Nope, same father, same mother.
Same father, same mother, same...
Yet they're not twins.
No. They're triplets.
Hey.
All right.
Oh, man.
So you hear Marcia and Marjorie, and in your mind is a Marcia and a Marjorie. But you don't realize there could be a Marcia or Marjorie and a Maggie, or Maggie is Marjorie. Anyway.
Yeah.
So this illustrates that point that one should often look to question your assumptions.
I mean, this is so hard.
But Einstein, if I can just get into the paradigm shift.
Yeah.
So most of science, but actually I claim that most of your life is run in a certain paradigm, right? You have a certain framework of your thinking, of your circumstances, just like physics does, of its theories, and you operate within that in a very limited range, and everything that you do is limited by that. So if you want to get out of that, if you're completely 100% happy, maybe you don't, but maybe you want something a little different. But the way to get out of that is to start questioning that and changing that and looking for different angles and try to formulate things in a different way.
Right, like thinking of space-time as the same, one and the same, rather than two different things.
Right. So, for instance, and Einstein lived in a time where we thought of motion and force, and that was the paradigm that you worked within. If you stay within that paradigm of forces, you never come up with Einstein's theory, and he was able to look beyond that and go to ignore that to the extent that he was open to other approaches. Okay, so that in itself didn't saying it's not a force. It's not like, oh, that must be this. That's not what happened. But as he was following his logical thinking through things, he didn't let the fact that we think the other way stop him from letting it lead to where it should lead. And that was really his genius.
So you talk about, and the way you just described it, like he's grinding through algorithms in his head to solve this problem. And yet you also talk in the book about sometimes the actual insight comes when you're in the shower, or you're not even thinking about the problem.
So I talk about two kinds of thinking, three kinds of information processing in Elastic. The simplest, I say is not even thinking, because if you look at the definition of thinking, it has to do with coming up with new conclusions. And the most basic information processing is scripted processing, hardwired into your brain, just like it is in a cockroach or an ant. And sometimes that's called fixed action patterns in psychology. But if you look at animals, non-human animals or non-primates, most of their behavior is pretty automatic, even though it might not appear that way. For instance, if you have a mother goose sitting on a nest and an egg rolls out, okay, the mother goose will take its neck and stretch it out and bring the egg back into the nest. That looks like a very clever or loving act by the mother goose, until you realize that if you put a beer can there, she'll do the same thing. She'll do it with a volleyball. She'll try and do it. And scientists have realized that having something nearby, even if it's not even round, is a trigger for this automatic program that she has. And these are the kind of programs that computers operate too. They're hardwired in. Well, people use that kind of programming too in some ways. When you're a simple example is when you're driving on autopilot. We call it autopilot, right? So when I used to teach at Caltech, I took the same route every day, and I found that, unfortunately, sometimes when I was going somewhere that was not Caltech, but started out like my Caltech route, I would end up at Caltech before I realized that I wasn't going to Caltech. But you see the stop sign, you turn right, you see that tree, you turn left, and then you're there, and you go, but I wasn't going there. Because there's triggers that make me do something, and I'm not even thinking about it, right? You do this in relationships. Sometimes with your significant other, you get into these cycles of fights where someone does, the other person responds in a pre-programmed way, and you respond, and you go down that road. So that's scripted thinking, and it happens a lot in social situations. There's a very interesting experiment I talk about in the book where back in the day when these were more common Xerox machines or copy machines, the psychologist, researcher stationed a graduate student near the copier, and when someone went up to make a copy, the graduate student ran up with some paper and said one of three things. The first thing was, the first way that it was said was, I have to Xerox 5 pages, can I get in front of you? The second one was, I have to Xerox 5 pages, can I get in front of you because I'm in a hurry? So the first method got about 50% compliance, which is even high. To me, it sounds rude, but 50% people said, okay. The second one, where you say, because I'm in a hurry, got 94%. So if you give that reason, so, the person's thinking about the reason, and they say, oh, yeah, go ahead, you're in a hurry. But that's not what was happening, because this is just like the mother goose. These were scripts that were running, and this is how the psychologists showed that. There was a third thing that was said. It was, excuse me, I have to Xerox 5 pages. Can I get in front of you? Because I have pages to Xerox. Now, because I have pages to Xerox gives no new information. So if the person is actually pondering things and using the new information, then that should be a 50% compliance, just like when there's nothing given, because there's no new information given. But if the person is just mindlessly reacting to the fact that there's a reason given, then it should be more like the 94%. And indeed, it was 93% with that. So just remember that it doesn't really matter. Just if you're asking for a favor, say because whatever. Because the sky is blue, can I borrow $10 because the sky is blue?
It's a little bit like your brain is auto-correcting it to something else. As if you were to say, can I go ahead of you because my child is dying and I have to photocopy or something like that.
It's looking for that because and not looking that closely at what
right.
Yeah. So that's the most primitive kind of information processing. Now the second kind is analytical or logical thought. So again, this is something computers are very good at. They can go A, look at A, follow the rules, and get to B, right? And that's traditionally what computers did. And that's what we value very highly in our society. We test that on the ACT, test that, the SAT, the LSAT. That's what employers are looking for. Can you have analytical thinking? But both analytical thinking and scripted thinking aren't really good when situations change. So obviously the mother goose through evolution was designed to pull the thing back into the nest, because usually if there's something right next to the nest, it's an egg that fell out, not a beer can. So it makes sense for evolution to design it that way. In a changing environment where sometimes it's a beer can or sometimes it's Donald Trump, you don't want to necessarily grab it and bring it into your nest, right? It could be dangerous. So when times change, you have to have other ways of thinking. The same thing with logical, analytical thinking. You have ways of reasoning things out, and if things don't change, those methods will still work, and you can use them. You can solve physics problems without finding a new paradigm scheme. You just work within the old one as long as there's no anomalies that get in your way. Elastic thinking is for when the change happens. Elastic thinking isn't about following rules, it's about inventing the rules, inventing the new rules, figure out when you need new rules, breaking the rules, how do you break the rules. So where analytical thinking is what we call top-down, there's an executive, they call it executive part of your brain, or an executive in a corporation, or executive in politics, the chief executive. They give you orders and everyone follows the orders, like in the military. That's top-down thinking, and your brain does some of that. It controls where you put your focus and how you think. The other kind of thinking is bottom-up. Elastic thinking is bottom-up. So elastic thinking comes from a zillion parts whose sum is a zillion parts whose whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Sounding like George Bush now.
Emergent.
It's called emergent behavior, but when the sum is greater than, if you just add up the parts, that's emergent behavior. So a prime example is ants. Ants follow very simple rules about when to turn right, turn left, stop, go, based on the chemical environment or hitting another ant. It's a very simple algorithm. They're not really smart. They don't have a huge brain, but they can do great things as a colony. So ants as a colony can build a bridge to get from one rock to another. They'll make a chain and build a bridge. There's no one designing the bridge. There's no one telling them what to do. It's all this individual simple decisions that somehow come together to do that. And because of billions of years of evolution, they've evolved in a way that the simple decisions can make complex colony level decisions like that. And our brains are the same way. The neurons in our brains are all firing according to very simple rules based on the inputs, and they give certain outputs. But like the ants, they can come up with brilliant ideas through emergent processes. So that's where your ideas come from when you get new ideas. They come from these bottom-up processes in your brain, which are largely unconscious. And eventually, some of them get through to your consciousness.
Let's go back and do a little brain anatomy for a moment. I mean, we have 85 billion neurons or so, 100 to 1,000 synaptic connections between the 85 billion neurons. But it's not just a blob of amorphous neurons, and they're all firing together. They're in columns and networks and modules and so on. So maybe walk us through how you get just single neurons firing to something we call a thought. What is a thought?
What is a thought? I do have a section.
I know. That's what I know. So give us the answer.
So your brain is hierarchically organized. There are structures such as the two hemispheres of the brain. Then there are substructures like the lobes, and the lobes have their own substructures, and there's substructures, and it goes all the way down to the individual neurons. And we used to think that the key to thinking were these larger structures that had very discrete purposes, and we're finding out more and more now that that's not the way it works. And the key are the very fine-grained neural networks that of many neurons, but not macroscopic quantities like that are the key to your to the way we think. And scientists have discovered that, just to give a short version, that concepts in your brain are stored by what they call sparse networks of neurons. So not a lot of neurons, but in a certain pattern will correspond to a concept. And if you, through your senses, for instance, are exposed to that concept, that will fire. For example, when people have epilepsy, they sometimes have to put electrodes into their brains to see where the misfiring is. And so people, for medical purposes, sometimes have electrodes in their brains that neuroscientists can piggyback on for their experiments. And they found, by looking at these, that certain individual neurons, that their patients would have certain neurons that would fire only when they saw a picture of Halle Berry. But they use different actors and pictures, but not necessarily Jennifer Aniston, the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
But now it doesn't matter if you're seeing her from the front, from the side, if she's disguised, if she's got a lot of makeup on in some superhero movie, or if it's just a text that says Halle Berry, this will fire. That's why they call it a concept neuron. So your brain is organized into zillions of these concept neurons, and the concept neurons have overlaps. And when one fires, it could trigger another. And these cause associations in your mind. And so your thinking is a series of associations where one concept triggers another, and it goes along in a string.
So this is how we get this, where you're sort of just free associating, and you end up, you start at one little place and you end up somewhere completely
right. So that's a good thing to bring up. Free associate. What is that? So most of this is going on in your unconscious mind. Your brain is constantly making a lot of associations with anything you're thinking of. So I say to you, let's go to Europe. You might say, oh, okay, let's look for a plane. You don't say, let's flap our wings, right? Or you don't say, let's swim there. But inside your mind, those thoughts could be coming. But odd and unpromising thoughts and behavior is suppressed by certain filters in your brain that serve to keep these. They're a gateway to keep certain things from getting to your mind. So if there's something wrong with these, you could appear mentally ill. For instance, if you're schizophrenia, you're constantly bombarded by odd thoughts and ideas which are not necessarily connected to reality because those filters are letting them through. But if you're very much on the other side, then none of that odd stuff gets through, but you might not be very creative because your brain is suppressing everything but the most conventional and most guaranteed ideas. Most people are somewhere in between that, and the key to a lot of problem solving and a lot of creative thinking is to find ways to open your brain and to relax those filters so more stuff comes out, without going off the deep end. But it's not just that you can do this, that you can change yourself permanently. You can also do this in different times of day. There are things you can do that tend to open up the filters for a while. So you are working really hard with your analytical thinking on some problem, and you are very focused, but maybe you hit a barrier and you can't get that jump that you need from your elastic thinking. Then you need to find ways to take your mind off that, to open your mind, to relax your mind, and then the ideas will start to pop into your mind. If you've ever had an insight laying in bed or in the shower, that's what's happening.
So some of the tricks you can use or tools you can employ to free up your mind to do that kind of creative thinking. Walk us through some of those, like I'm already taking a shower at least once a week, so and go for a walk, So, but
yeah, well, okay. There's certain things first of all, there's certain things not to avoid. So, avoid a deadline. So, give yourself time. Okay, trying to rush the solution, trying to go, I got to figure this out in the next half hour or hour. Focuses that suppresses things. Yeah, you have to let go of your fear of failure. So often we don't like bad ideas. Most of us are sometimes right, sometimes wrong. We don't dwell on when we are wrong, but you should dwell on when you were wrong. It's very important to accept that you can be wrong and go with it and embrace that, because by being wrong a lot, you can get different ideas that are sometimes right, and they're different. If you're always getting the same idea that everyone else has, you're not going to stand out. So getting rid of your fear of failure, making a company where the employees don't fear having dumb ideas, or where you're not afraid to look stupid in front of your boss, is very important. So that's, these are ways that you're trying not to suppress your filters. Working very hard on the problem and then taking yourself away is very good, whether that means that can be running on a treadmill. Sometimes physical exercise is really good because it diminishes your executive focus because you're working so hard on the treadmill or whatever you're doing, but it still allows your unconscious mind to work. Or being totally relaxed. Meditation is really good. Learning how to meditate, which means you can control and relax your mind, is a very good technique.
I like the one where you have a larger room, a higher
yeah.
ceiling.
So people who work with low
open,
ceilings tend to be less creative because it somehow that physical, because and Tony Damasio wrote that, just has this recent book about the connection between the mind and the body. Your mental processes are very dependent on your physical sensations, the feelings of your body, what your senses are taking in, and having like a low, squashed-in little room, tends to constrain you, and it makes you it works against freeing up your filters. But having wide open space, a high ceiling, or being outside can have the opposite effect.
Literally thinking out of the box. I mean, it's almost like that. Your concept neurons for small room also restricts your thinking to small thinking.
Yeah, and another thing which is not that easy to control, but you would like to do it anyway, is happiness versus anxiety. So negative emotion is bad for your creative thinking. Negative emotion, think about it. What does fear make you do? It makes you want to flee, or anger makes you maybe want to fight. It's focusing you on a certain behavior. Happiness doesn't focus you on a certain behavior. Gratitude doesn't focus you on a certain behavior. So it's good for your life in general, but there are exercises you can do to increase your happiness and your positive emotions. And when you're really up and positive, you can be more innovative and make more discoveries. There are famous examples of scientists who discovered things on some euphoric vacation, like quantum mechanics,
right.
Schrodinger. So there's something about that.
Tell us about that story. What is that story with Schrodinger?
Well, okay. Schrodinger was a strange guy. Heisenberg invented a form of quantum mechanics, and Schrodinger didn't believe it. And this was in the beginning when no one quite understood what Heisenberg was saying anyway. And so Schrodinger was a very modern person sexually.
and libertine.
Well, he had an open marriage, and he had mistresses, and he went off on a kind of a sex vacation with one of them, with this idea in mind that he didn't like Heisenberg's stuff, and he came up with his own version while there.
That must have been some interesting pillow talk.
Yeah, I bet it. Well, I mean, I don't know. I haven't had the experience that it's necessarily sexy.
That's not how you do it.
Equate. Yeah. I don't know, but maybe that's the key. Anyway, it turned out in the end that he came up with a whole other version, but they're mathematically equivalent. So he didn't really accomplish his goal, and they hated each other for the rest of their lives. So physicists are human. So let's get back to they're not the brain in the jar.
Yeah. When I was asking Kip Thorne about what he would recommend to young students that they go into based on what he did when he was a young man, he said go into a field that's not crowded, that is, hasn't already been explored and worked at for so long. It's harder to not only stand out amongst the crowd of so many people working on it, but also everything's already been kind of worked through. It's harder to find something new. So gravitational waves was something no one had really given all that much thought to or had worked on much. And so I wonder if you would recommend, as one of the tools of elastic thinking, find something that hasn't been ground down by so many people.
Well, or maybe the opposite. I mean that's a matter of taste, and there are advantages to both. But if you're the real elastic thinker, then the fact that other people have attacked it doesn't matter because you have a different approach. So it's all about finding your own approach.
Right.
Yeah.
But what's the balance between knowing so much about a field that it's harder to think out of the box versus not knowing enough? And you can think out of the box, but people have already thought out of the box the same way for a century, and you just don't know enough to know that.
So you should find out what other people are doing at some point. But not necessarily right away, because like Richard Feynman, who was a famous physicist, once told me that when he sees a paper, he doesn't like to read the paper. He sees the result and he goes and tries to derive it himself, because he doesn't want to be led the wrong way by the person who wrote the paper. And that's the danger of when you read what other people do, because often it's the novice who makes the discovery, because they don't know all the other stuff that other people know. And once you start looking at whatever people do, you start thinking like them, and you don't want to think like them.
Right. Stephen Jay Gould wrote an interesting essay once about Feynman, that Gould had been invited to come speak to Caltech, as just a public talk, and Feynman saw he was coming, so Feynman wrote him and says, I've worked out some ideas about evolutionary theory. I'd like to talk to you about them. And so I guess he spent like a half an hour describing these brand new ideas he had just come up with, which was essentially just sexual selection that Darwin had figured out a century before. And there was, a century's worth of literature on this very thing. And Gould's like, well, we already know all that.
Right. So Yeah, well, that's a very good story because I think that one of the really important things, and we don't all have this luxury in life, is to not worry about that. I think it's just exciting to discover something that someone else already discovered, as it is to be unless your ego is really big, to be the first one to discover it, because there's a joy and a excitation from discovery, and I'd rather waste my time and discover it myself than read that Darwin did it. And Feynman was very much like that. And of course, if you're not a tenured professor, it could be harder. But in your life, you can you can do that. And I mean, that's just a very good approach to things. And I quote a very touching letter that Feynman wrote to one of his former students. The student had written him to apologize that he's not working on very important problems. And he said, Feynman was like a god amongst physicists. And so he wrote, "You did all these great things, and I'm so sorry that I don't live up to that, and I'm just working on these little things." And Feynman wrote back a very touching letter saying that, you misunderstand me, and when you knew me, I was doing things that turned out to revolutionize physics. That was just by chance. I'm always doing the same things. I'm attacking whatever problem that you attack that you can solve is a wonderful problem and worth doing. And it doesn't matter if it's big, small, someone else did it, no one else did it. And I even add to that, which is not in the letter, that even if you have a great idea for something that doesn't work, it can still be a beautiful idea that you should pat yourself on the back for. If Feynman's stuff turned out to have some flaw in it and not quite work, it would mean that it's not very useful, but it would still be a beautiful theory with a little flaw in it. If you have a beautiful thing and has a little flaw in it, you don't throw it out, except in physics. In physics, you throw it out. But in art, you might say, that Picasso is wonderful, except what's that over there? You don't just say, I hate this whole picture. You go, oh, I don't know about that. Why didn't he make the eyes straight? I don't know, but
or even on the face instead of over here. Yeah.
So I think that's it's just that attitude, when you're approaching something, to have that attitude is very freeing.
He wrote that book, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out.
Right.
The pure pleasure. In one of his colleagues at Caltech, not Gelman, it was the other guy.
Gelman would be considered probably an anti-Caltech.
Anyway,
I see you know. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It was when Feynman was dying of cancer. I mean, he didn't have but a few months to live, and this fellow whose name David
Pulitzer?
No. The guy that hosted the PBS physics series, and he was the dean of Caltech for a while.
Yeah. He wasn't really he wasn't in the theory. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, but he told this story about he contacts Feynman to see how he's doing, and I'm working on this problem, and he's is it the theory of everything kind of problem? No, it's just some tiny little minuscule, completely unimportant. He's just doing it for fun, knowing he's dying. He's got only months to live or whatever, just for the pure pleasure of it. Yeah. And there was another Feynman story. And one of the Nova shows about Feynman, where he says, people ask me, am I trying to figure out the entire the theory that explains the entire universe? No, I'm not. I'm just trying to solve specific problems that are doable. Let's shift to talking about sort of a childish way of thinking out of the box. You have a section on how children think versus how adults think and solve problems. I used to do have this little magic trick I would do for my classes or audiences or whatever. So I had this opaque box, and you open the top of the box, and inside is this cube, this wooden cube with a different colored dot on each side. So I would hand it and say, okay, pick one here without my seeing, and put it so that one of the dots is face up, and show that to everybody. Put the lid on, and then I will, behind my back, figure out what it is based on synesthesia, because I can see colors through the tips of my fingers. Okay, this is just bullshit, but and then I, as I brought it up, behind my back, I would put the top over on the side, and I could just see. But you're holding it in such a way that no one could see this. Okay, adults have the hardest time figuring this out. So the first time I did this for a class of little kids, they go, oh, of course, you got the top on the side, like. and my magician friends tell me that the best audiences are like at MIT or Mensa groups, because they're so smart. They're the easiest to fool. So there's something about There's something about the simplicity of a child where you can see things that adults can't see. So what's going on there?
Well, when you're maturing, the last part of your brain to mature is a part called the prefrontal cortex. And the last part of the prefrontal cortex to mature is a part called the lateral prefrontal cortex, which lateral means to the side, but it's not just geographic. There are different kinds of cells, and so only primates have that part of the brain, the lateral prefrontal cortex. All mammals have the prefrontal cortex. And that matures around 25. And guess what that is part of? It's part of your filtering system. So that's the thing that knocks out these crazy ideas, which is why kids can have crazy ideas and crazy behavior. I mean, it's probably evolutionarily more connected, not necessarily just to the ideas, but to the acting out of those ideas and the behavior. So kids are much more uninhibited. They have crazy behavior. They're not held down. It's not just the prior preconceived notions. It is, but the preconceived notions are acting through this thing that they don't have yet. So it's getting those preconceived notions and getting the physical thing there that stops you from, like I was a kid, I jumped off the roof of our school because it seemed like a fun thing to do. And it wasn't good for my ankle. And I know better now, but I didn't have the ability to even, impose that knowledge, even someone had told me back then. And when you get older, you have another childhood because that's also part of your brain that can decay. It can decay through, mini strokes, TIAs, or through real, bigger strokes, or through, they don't totally understand, but, the onset of certain kinds of dementia. So my father, for instance, I think I tell this in the book.
Yeah, you do, yeah.
He had a stroke there, and he was in his late 70s, and, we're walking in a restaurant, and he's hungry, we're all hungry, we want to get to the table and eat, and certainly the food on everyone else's table as we walk by, it looks really good. And even though it looks really good, my unconscious mind might say, grab some, but I wouldn't do it because I don't even think of it because it gets filtered out. But his filter doesn't work, so he thought of it, and he did it. So he grabbed a handful of fries as we walked by some person's table. And, that's just the way the brain works.
Well, but those filters are probably a good idea for most.
Well, they're good and bad. So right. They are. Then they're good. Well, they're good for survival if you don't jump off roofs, right? So when we get older, we don't usually.
But I like the story about. Well, you have many stories of interesting people in the book that are creative, and we've heard of, like Seth MacFarlane, whose success in part at least comes from thinking sort of like a child, like a cartoon character. And maybe that's one of the keys to success. Just sort of
right. So I talked. He was talking about the effect of the intense criticism he sometimes gets on social media from people on his creativity and others. Because if you're not totally PC, you'll get massively attacked by people, and you might say, I don't care, but it has some kind of impeding effect on your thinking because you can't be free. You can't be open to ideas. So he is called, and I found all these articles, they call him sophomoric, right? And that's interesting. You might think whether you like his humor or not, sophomoric I think is a good thing, because it's again, you're young and you're coming up with new ideas. Now you may, his taste, and it's not a question of that, but of his taste and whether you like his humor, but it's a question of having that childish, childlike tendency is a good thing.
Right, and you talk about, sophomoric is supposed to be an insult.
Right.
But in this case, it's just another tool.
Okay, Einstein didn't wear socks. I don't wear socks either, but now it's very common not to wear socks, right? Especially in California. But back then, you can imagine in the 1920s and 30s, it was very strange not to wear socks. He didn't comb his hair. His doctor told him not to smoke. So if he saw a cigarette butt on the ground, he'd pick it up and smoke it because he didn't buy cigarettes. So is that soft, all that stuff? Yeah, my mother would say, Lenny, you're acting like a child.
Good.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, so, and that kind of gets us into, as we slide more toward abnormal thinking that helps you think out of the box. The problem with the words we have for like mental illness, like schizophrenia or paranoia, delusional, it sounds negative, but schizotypy thinking, where it sounds a little less pejorative, and you're leading you to think out of the box. So you talk about John Nash, and the research by Nancy Andreessen, yeah, about the relationship between, again, I don't like to use the word mental illness, but something like that, and creativity. And that someone like John Nash, who is talking to aliens half his life and hearing voices and conspiracies and all that, which are patterns that are not true, but the same source in his mind also led him to come up with some of these mathematical game theory models that led to the Nobel Prize. So and the way you describe it is that it's almost like normal brains are just bubbling up with all kinds of crazy ideas, and our prefrontal cortex suppresses them mostly and filters out the really crazy ones, and the sort of mainstream ones come through that are socially acceptable. And for the schizotypy thinking, the filters are more wide open. But obviously there must be some balance there between letting in too many crazy ideas where you've just gone off the rails versus you win a Nobel Prize.
Right, and what was really interesting was the quote I have in there that he said. So he was a schizophrenic. Well, first he did his great. He was borderline. He did his great work. Then he went over the edge and was schizophrenic for years, and then he came back and was functional again. And it's really not. It's not a yes or no. It's a spectrum. And the quote that I really liked, which I won't get exactly right, but it was where someone when he became non-schizophrenic again, one of his friends said to him, how could you, you're a really smart guy, so how could you really think that there were, you're talking to aliens and people or other planets are invading and there's a big conspiracies and stuff, and how could you think that this stuff was really real? And he said, because those ideas came to me in exactly the same way as my mathematical ideas. It seemed just as reasonable. So that shows you what, if the filters aren't working, your behavior can go off. And people who are not quite there can have really great new ideas and new ways of looking at things and still be functional. And so actually I give it several, and depending on different traits, I give several they call inventories in there, which are questionnaires you can take to assess your level of different traits, like your schizotypy is one of them. Where
I got a 0 on that. You
got a 0?
Yeah, I don't have any of these.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, it's really.
Yeah, I can see that.
It was kind of depressing, really. But people sometimes find me aloof and distant. Are you sometimes sure that other people can tell what you're thinking? I feel I have to be on my guard, even with friends. When shopping, do you get the feeling other people are taking notice of you? Like, have you ever experienced with astrology, seeing the future, UFOs or ESP? Obviously not me. I sometimes use words in unusual ways. Well, scientists would do that. I guess they're trying to tap into.
Well, that particular test is very skewed because most of the tests you rate your answer like from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, and the means are pretty much in the middle, and there's people on both ends. That test 0 is not that unusual. The mean I think is 2.
Yeah.
And if you do more than like 3 or 4, you're out there. So, but anyway, I didn't make up the tests. These are from the psychology literature, and they've been given to hundreds of people, and they rate them that way. But yeah. So.
Yeah, over 6, then you're starting to lean toward that type of thinking. I mean, I can see what they're getting at there. That you're finding patterns that you see patterns that other people don't see. And usually they're incorrect. I mean, this is what, Popper's idea of conjecture and refutation of how science works. You're just throwing things out, spitballing ideas as fast as you can. Most of them are probably nonsense. But every once in a while, one of them turns out to be true. So that's how science makes its progress. So this is why science has to be conservative in the sense that even most scientists are wrong. We're mostly wrong, most of us, about most of what we think. So you got to have checks and balances and feedback from other people, or else you're going to go off the rails and not even know it. So it seems to me that this idea that if I could somehow break free of the box, I'm going to have these genius ideas. Well, you must get these letters like even more than I get, which I call these theories of everything. These are people that, mostly guys, that come up with these alternative theories of physics. Newton was wrong, Einstein was wrong, Hawking, Feynman are wrong. But I've been working in the basement all weekend, and I'm pretty sure I figured it out. and if you can help me with the math, I'll share the Nobel Prize with you. Okay. You must get these.
Yes, I do.
Okay, so because I send them to you
what's
usually.
Important is, I was going to say, I try not to be the one on the other end. I try not to send those ideas to the journals.
Yes, well, because you know everybody. You could send them to Hawking, but that's a creative. I get the impression these people are smart. I don't know how educated they are, but they don't know much about physics. But they're smart and obviously creative to come up with new ideas, but they're mostly wrong.
Well, there's different ways to define creativity. Usually it's defined as coming up with something different and useful. So they would not be called creative. It's one reason I didn't write about creativity, but I wrote about the processes that can contribute to creativity. It's a bigger field than creativity, but it also doesn't have anything to do with being useful. It has to do with how do you get, I talk about how you can apply it, but I'm really talking about how does you get your brain to think differently. So, this can be okay, but the question is when someone comes up with the ideas, are they really different, or are they just random? Sometimes they just seem to sound like random ideas came, which is not the same thing as different, because they're not really, they have no meaning. They're just words.
Right, they're just words, right. Word salad.
Word salad.
Yeah. Well, we want to leave enough time for questions from the audience. Let me just say, as you're formulating your questions, that I love the book. Our host Andrew in the green room was saying, he knows nothing about the field and learned a lot because you're such a clear writer. And I know a lot about the field, and I still learned a lot that I didn't know. So congratulations on a marvelous book.
Thank you. And coming from you, means a lot, Mike.